In the end, it's always, was I loved enough and did I love enough? When I think of triumph in the face of death, it's really about completing relationships, which means expressing forgiveness and gratitude and love. It's about being around those core group of people that are there at the very end. That's what gives life meaning.
Hi everyone, I'm Talia. Welcome to Tales of Triumph, the Love Metals podcast, where we celebrate courage, resilience, and love in the face of life's challenges. December is a time for reflection, a season to honor endings and embrace new beginnings. Today we explore the end-of-life journey with Tracy Chalmers. Tracy is an end-of-life doula, co-founder of the Grief Well, and a founding director of the End-of-Life Doula Association of Canada. She also teaches at Douglas College and has spent nearly a decade supporting individuals during their final moments with care and compassion. Just as December symbolizes transitions, Tracy's insights will inspire you to face life's changes with courage and love. If you enjoy this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue to bring these meaningful stories to you. Let's dive into this inspiring conversation. Please enjoy. This episode contains content of a sensitive nature that may be triggering for some individuals. Hi, Tracy. Thank you so much for being our guest today. This is a conversation I have been eagerly awaiting because I'm going to assume you have very unique and special insight into a part of life we are all guaranteed to personally face at some point, and that's death. So I'd love to just dive straight into it and begin by asking you to please share, what does an end-of-life doula do?
An end-of-life doula does many things, which is, I think, what makes this role so amazing. The scope of practice is very vast. And I often say to people, it's just sort of like being like water and flowing to where the need is. So there's many things that we can do to companion the dying and their people. When I start to explain the role to folks, I often invite people to consider a birth doula because many people are familiar with that role, someone that supports people that are birthing and their families non-medically. And that's what end-of-life doulas do at the end of life. So we provide advocacy, education, resources, companioning. We can vigil for folks, provide respite, engage in legacy projects, support people after a death with bereavement support. And we can work with perfectly healthy people to do end-of-life planning, which is something that all of us can benefit from doing.
Has this been around for ages and it's just something that we're starting to become more aware of now?
Yeah, well, obviously, as long as there's been people companioning the dying. And I think the big turning point was when death left the home. Because before that, it would be people, families, communities that would support their dying. People would die in their homes and families would provide this care. Children would watch, the process of dying happen. And often people would be, wheeled down the road to a local church and, buried in a cemetery. But since death has left the home, we've really lost our familiarity with death. And this care now is typically outsourced. So with this outsourcing of care, there's many gaps in care, which is how the role of end-of-life doula has emerged to address these gaps. And it's a really new role. So when I took the training from Douglas College in 2017, there was no End-of-Life Doula Association of Canada. There was no body of knowledge. There was no scope of practice. It was in 2018 that myself and a group of 5 other people actually locked ourselves in a room for a weekend and we wrote all of that. We wrote the body of knowledge, the scope of practice. We created the association as a center for excellence. So as far as being like a formal role as part of the palliative care team, even though it is a privately obtained role, it's a very new role in healthcare.
That's wonderful. How do you help those with terminal illness find strength and courage in facing life's final adversity when fear and uncertainty and pain may be very present for them?
There's a lot of things. I think the first thing to do when fear and pain and adversity are present is to create a container for those big feelings to be held, because so often those feelings are minimized or people themselves are uncomfortable with those big feelings. So the first thing I would do would be to honor the
Mm.
feelings that the person's having, really allow them to feel seen and heard, really allow myself to feel with them. So to be like a sieve and let their story and their experience really touch me so that I can feel with them, which is empathy. I would express that empathy that I see you, I hear you, I'm feeling with you, and it's a lot.
Yeah.
And when we can do that, we can really make things a lot better for folks.
Yeah.
I have this approach of my 5 roots of practice. One of the aspects of that is meeting the dying where they're at. So, really taking the time to listen and find out where they're at and what their needs are, being sort of like a clear vessel and just really open heart, open mind, listening. Another thing that I think is very important is to honor autonomy, to always give people the ability to make their own decisions. Another thing when we are supporting the dying is to empower the friends and family to provide care. So it's not about me swooping in and making everything beautiful, but it's about modeling care. It's about normalizing what's happening. It's about validating everyone's feelings and inviting those closest to provide care. The 4th root of practice I try to practice by is to show up with the deepest presence I can. And this is just this ability to put my feet on the floor and keep breathing and keep my heart as soft as possible.
Mm.
And the last thing is to lean out on other people after I'm done companioning the dying, because it's quite energetically intense work. And so to have my practices be out in the forest and live my ordinary life so that I can be reminded of the life that's present for me now and not take on the things that aren't mine to carry.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I love all that. And what I'm hearing from what you just shared is there's such an aspect of doing this in community that everybody is a part of it. Everybody deserves to be honored and supported through all of this, not just the people leaving this world, but it's everyone around them too. Is having your clients celebrate their victories in life a part of helping them find peace and acceptance as they approach the end?
Yeah, absolutely. So, anytime at end of life where you can find meaning, connection, pleasure, presence, love, it's sort of what we're going for in end of life care. Absolutely, victories are huge because that's really what makes meaning in life, right? Right now, I'm working with a woman who is 95 years old and she's having a maid provision this summer. So
Okay.
she, that quality of life has gotten to the point where she really can't do much other than just go through her daily routine. And she gets exhausted because she has shortness of breath.
Mm.
So she's very much ready to die. But she contacted me because she said she needs to do inner work,
Okay.
which is essentially spiritual work. She's not religious, but there's always a spiritual aspect to dying, and that sort of sense of something bigger than ourselves, or what brings meaning to life. And so we're doing just that. Her and I together are looking at her triumphs and the things in her life that really stand out. We're doing a life review, which is we started from when she was just a baby, and we're talking about the ups and the downs, but it's just beautiful to see her remembering those things. And she
Wow.
just lights up and shares them. And at the end of these visits, there's that focus on life and not on death.
Yes.
And this is not a death denying kind of a thing, but it's a life affirming activity. And I think that's really an important thing to keep in mind when companioning the dying, to always focus on life that is until the very last moment.
I love that. And what a gift and a blessing for you to be able to hear all these life reviews from people. That must be so impactful and enjoyable in so many different ways. Can you share some of the most inspiring stories of triumph that people have shared with you over the years as they do these reviews of their lives?
It always comes back to love. Like it really does. Like in the end, it's always, was I loved enough and did I love enough? Like truly, it's almost always about people. When I think of triumph in the face of death, it's really about completing relationships, which means expressing forgiveness and gratitude and love. And it's about being around those core group of people that are there at the very end. That's what gives life meaning. It's not about what you did. It's not about, obviously what you acquired. The word triumph, I think, is fitting because it's a very grand word. And relationships and love are grand. They're the biggest thing. They're the end game for most people, right? Yeah. But it's not the big things. It's the quieter things, right?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's so beautiful. I'm very touched by everything you're saying, and there's stuff going on in my own life that I'll share a bit more about a little later in this conversation, but that was very beautiful. Thanks, Tracy. Do you feel knowing your life's purpose and whether or not you've had a positive impact on people is important in being able to have peace and closure in the end?
It is. There was a book that was written, I don't know, a handful of years ago by a woman named Bronnie Ware, and it was the top 5 regrets of the dying. And they
Hmm.
were things like that. Like the number one regret was I wished I had lived a life more true to myself as opposed to the life that others expected of me. I wish I'd spent more time with my friends. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. I wish I'd let myself be happier. These are the regrets that a lot of people that are dying have.
So then how do you help navigate them through that when it's the end of their life and they're thinking back, I wish I had done this, I wish I had done that? How do you help them transform that so that they're not carrying that energy into the last moments?
I love that you said caring because that's the metaphor I use when I work with people. I think of people on the end of life journey, going on a journey. And my approach is how can I help them travel light?
Mm.
Almost like they have a backpack on, right? The first thing I do is I normalize that everybody that dies has regret. Everybody does. If you're human and you've lived a life, there's things that you have done that you regret. So sharing that with people, just that regret's normal and we all have it, is huge. And then the thing about regret, looking back on your life and seeing regrets as big boulders, like there's a boulder field. And so what do? You walk back and you just acknowledge what your regrets are. You be with them. You pick them up, you feel the weight of them, and you really just be with them and put them down. And in this way, they change. They're not as heavy. It's just this acceptance almost that lets you leave them where they are. That's part of the work I'm doing with this woman right now is she's sharing regrets. And just like any kind of grief, when we share it, then we're not carrying it on our own, right? We
Yes.
invite others to come alongside and help us carry it. So in that way, things become lighter.
Yes.
So
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love that. And then I guess part of that is also changing the perspective on those regrets that one may have and the storytelling that we have around them. So, what role does storytelling play in end of life care? And how do you help people craft narratives that honor their life experiences?
I love that question because it's something that I'm very intentional about. And I have these 3 parts to it when I find myself creating these narratives for people. So the first part is this role of story catcher. So really listening deeply when people are telling me a story so I can really catch it and I can really hold it. And what I mean by that is if the story is full of regret or grief or something really heavy, the first thing I'll do is really just honor the weight of it and just really allow the person that I am with to know that this is big and of course you're feeling that way. And then the other thing that I think of very intentionally is story weaving. And I almost think of it as like heaving the threads of everything that was shared because there is always grief and there's always regrets, but there's always love, there's always connection, there's always meaning, there's always this other stuff that is so beautiful and deeply inspiring that sometimes when people are expressing the heavy stuff, they can't see the other stuff. So it's almost like I pull those other threads to the surface and just like weave them
Oh,
together.
yeah.
And then there's the story telling where I will repeat back the whole picture to the person I'm supporting. So it's not sugarcoating, it's acknowledging how hard things are. But what really inspires me about what you shared is just, the love that you have for your people, or how much this brought you meaning, or the connection you have to this, so that you can almost give people back this more balanced perspective of what they've shared with you, because those things are always there. It's in every conversation, really, just this constant reassurance. People struggle so much with good enoughness, and like it just is in every conversations. It just kind of happens all the time.
Has there ever been a time when you've had your own doubts and fears while supporting a client? And how did you overcome them?
Yeah, of course, this happens because I'm human, right? I doubt myself. Of course, I have that am I good enough
Get
question,
it.
right?
Yes.
And yet, there's a couple of things that really bring me comfort. One in particular is this idea that a teacher of mine, Reverend Bodhi B, shared with me when I first met him in his little death store in Haiku, Maui. He said that if a person's lived their entire life to end up in their dying bed, and you've lived your entire life to end up in the chair beside that bed, that you are the one that's meant to be there in that moment. So that's that aspect of faith
Mm.
and just trusting that I'm enough. And something I've come to learn over the years that I know so deeply is that this role isn't about doing anything. It's about being something. It's about being this compassionate presence. It's about being as connected to your heart as you can and really showing up that way. And this is something we can all do. It's not about reading 1,000 books or taking 5 doula trainings, or like we can do this now. And as soon as I'm reminded of the simplicity of just knowing I'm enough and knowing what is needed is companionship, and what that is just being present and walking alongside. Dr. Alan Wolfelt has the most beautiful companioning model. And there's a whole bunch of tenets to the model. And the last line is the definition of companioning is to walk into the wilderness of the soul with another without feeling like you have to find the way out. So it's
Mm.
not about redirecting, it's just walking alongside. So I really know that to be true. I remember one time in particular being really brought to my knees with overwhelm around the intensity of feeling when there was a woman I was companioning who was dying, and she was 55, and she really didn't want to die. She really didn't want to die. And she just fought it tooth and nail. She hired a team, and she had a nutritionist, and she had people researching cutting edge research on her disease all over the globe to see if
Mm.
there was any hope. Like, she was fighting. She'd called to get all her appointments moved up because she didn't want to wait, and very aggressively chasing life. And I just remember the one day in the local hospital here, she was in palliative care before she entered hospice. And I stopped in to see her, and she was in her bed, and I was sitting at the foot of her bed. And she just looked at me and just said, I don't want to leave the people I love. Like, she just did not want to leave so desperately, and just started bawling. And I just imagined for a moment what it must feel like to not want to leave the people you love, and yet feel like that's happening regardless of how desperately you want it. I actually felt really, I want to say, powerless in the moment. I cried with her. In retrospect, that was the most fitting thing to do, because what can you say to someone that's expressing that fear?
Yeah.
You know, and she
Yeah.
doesn't want to leave, and I can't do anything about it. But I could feel with her, and I could sit with her, and I could open my heart to that hell. I so wanted to be able to do anything to make it better, but I knew that would just minimize her experience, which was the biggest experience I've ever been
Yes.
around. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I was thinking as you were sharing that if there is such a thing as the ultimate fear, it would be leaving the people you love. and not being able to do anything about it. My heart goes out to her and anyone who has or is experiencing that. And also just acknowledging you for being such a generous and open soul to be there with her during that and experience that with her. Did it change for her in the last moments? Was there something that shifted for her that came over her and was able to give her some peace around that fear of hers?
That's a good question. Her dying was very beautiful and very gentle, as hard as it was. She did transition into hospice, and there were some very beautiful things that were done around her in her dying time. And she was in this place of like held by love. And it really was quite remarkable. Quite often with these things, it's a very normal stage of dying to have this dark night of the soul, this deep questioning, what happens when you die, or where am I going to go? And I don't want to leave the people I love, and all this, which often people pass through once they've felt all those enormous feelings, or once they've had someone to witness them. People do often transition through into more of a place of acceptance, which is where I really believe she did get to.
Beautiful. I love that. I imagine there are often complex family dynamics that you have to navigate. How do you ensure both the patient's wishes and the family's needs are being respected and addressed?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum and families are complicated. And yet, in some ways, I really see it as being simple. The dying person is the most important person. They can pretty much say or do anything, really. And my goal is to keep the focus on the dying person and always advocate for their wishes. And sometimes this is where the art of being a doula comes in, where you want to gently remind people of, wishes. You have to tread carefully when you are dealing with families. I'm not a counselor. There's amazing people out there, social workers, counselors that are trained in things more like conflict resolution and bringing people together. But what's remarkable is that when you see and hear somebody, it just changes things. So when I consider working in the context of families, I do what I can to see and hear each family member. It's not about bringing people into agreement. It's just allowing each person to feel seen and heard, and always bring the focus back to the dying person. I also work with families to really normalize what's happening. So what happens in a crisis is personalities intensify. So it's really interesting, because you can probably look at your family right now and go, oh yeah, my mom's going to do this and my dad's going to do this and my siblings, because it's what they've always done. When crisis hits and, a diagnosis happens, there's this feeling like everything is so chaotic. But really, the family dance, this is a metaphor that was developed by Susan Costin, who's a social worker on Vancouver Island. She talks about this family dance. And the family's doing steps they've always done. Nothing's random. What happens when someone gets a diagnosis is the person either lies down or sits down on the dance floor, and the music gets faster and louder. So it feels chaotic. But if people can take a step back and look at their family dance, it's actually quite predictable. So sharing information like that helps people understand that, yeah, it's normal, and this is just what your family does.
Has there ever been a time when the family dynamic has been chaotic or not healthy, let's say, and then through this dance, there has been some kind of beautiful healing that's taken place?
Typically, what happens is if families are resilient going into a death, typically the end of life journey will bring families even closer. If families are fragile, or if there's a lot of underlying issues, it can be that end of life journey can actually fracture the family, and relationships change. But
Yeah.
there absolutely can be time for renewal and strengthening, a lot of healing for sure. When I work with families, there's a really beautiful approach to relationships that I've learned from a palliative care physician named Ira Bioch. And he talks about the four things. He talks about this idea of completing relationships. So he says, in order to do that, so people have this sense of completion, we need to express forgiveness. So in guiding people to say, I forgive you for, and please forgive me for. Guiding people to say, I'm grateful for, an expression of gratitude. Guiding people to say, I love you, and goodbye. And if people can express those things, it really does offer a sense of completion. I was working with a family during COVID where the father was dying. He was only 50 and he had two young boys. And I suggested this, and the mother thought it was a great idea. She had them write letters to their dad with those four things. And they went into the hospice and they had their letters and they stood at his bedside and they read those four things to their dad. And he ended up dying the next day. And she's so grateful, though, that the boys said what needed to be said. There was nothing left unsaid. And those letters actually were put inside his casket when he was cremated, and they went with him. And the beautiful thing about the completion piece is that it doesn't have to happen when the person's alive.
Yeah.
So as you said, families are complicated, relationships can be complicated. Maybe even just writing those things out or burning them, or if someone's already deceased, you can still speak them or journal them. These are ways that energetically we can be changed by expressing things, and it doesn't have to be directly to the person if that's not the most fitting thing for your relationship.
Beautiful. I love that. I firmly believe in that for myself. And then also it's such a lovely way not to put pressure on it, like you said, having to happen in those moments. And if it doesn't happen, to then feel like that can never be. Yeah, beautiful. I'm personally interested in hearing more about the Grief Well, which is a grief support community site you've created. The universe, in all of its perfection and uncanny timing, has had me experience deep, profound loss and grief for the first time 3 days before having this interview with you today. And I lost someone very dear to me on Monday. So I am sorry. I would love to know more about the Grief Well and how it helps people navigate through grief, because this is something I have never, ever gone through before.
Yeah. So I feel that. I really feel the intensity of your emotions, and it is uncanny because we were supposed to talk last month.
I know. I know.
And then here we are. So yeah, it makes you wonder.
It really does.
I think what would be the most fitting way to answer that question would be just to share a little bit about what we believe at the Grief Well. And when I say we, I have a partner, Willow Miley, who lives on Vancouver Island in Victoria, and we have spent years laying the bricks of this Grief Well. It's been a very slow, very intentional build. And we really believe that we need more spaces and ways to connect with our grief.
Yeah.
It's actually quite interesting because you are somebody that focuses on love, and really that's the end game of grief, is to keep your heart tender and soft and to not let it harden. So grief is such an opportunity. We really see that at the Grief Well, is if we can be with our pain and if we can hold it, that it really has the ability to deepen our connection to self and then others. It's really the stuff that empathy is made of, but it's really hard. Martin Prechtel wrote a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, and he says grief is like someone our parents warn us not to hang out with. Like somehow I always think of like a shady guy in like an alley or something, but like, somehow it's going to swallow us up or hurt us, or we'll never get out of it.
Right.
But there's two levels of connecting with grief, and one is a personal level. So it's just being with your feelings. And the next is sharing your grief with others. Grief is something that we do, not something that happens to us. And how we do it is we reach out to others. And this vulnerability creates connection. And it's actually quite a beautiful design. So at the grief well, we really honor that you are the expert in your grief. And it's really about slowing down and listening to how to best care for yourself. We tend a lot to the body and somatic experiences. We use nature as a partner to help us feel this sense of belonging and connection. We really believe in community. We challenge a lot of the cultural narratives around grief because there's a lot of really unsupportive cultural narratives. So we talk a lot about what stories do you hold about grief and are they supportive? So,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for creating and providing it for people like myself who are going through this or have gone through it. What are some of the triumphs you've witnessed, not in the people who are leaving this world, but in the ones who are saying goodbye to a loved one?
That's a good question. A teacher of mine, Stephen Levine, says this: how do you open your heart in hell? I think that idea of, even though the most horrible thing is happening, the people that are able to meet this experience with love, I think that is the triumph. And not just the time leading up to death, but the time after. I think a triumph for friends and family of people that are dying is understanding that dying is a social event and that we need a lot of people around. We're not good about that in this culture. We are taught to be so individualistic and stoic and do it ourselves, but dying calls for something very different. So this idea of asking for help when it's needed is vulnerable, but I think that that's definitely a triumph, and allowing others in to help you and hold you through this, because dying is communal and grieving is communal. And it's hard because grief is so private. And actually, when it usually happens at the very beginning, people often go inward. There's this shock, there's numbness, there's this feeling like the loss isn't real. For so many people, grief is really isolating. And especially in this culture where we're so afraid of being sad. And the most ironic thing is, in order to feel happy and be at peace, the way to do it is to feel you're sad. But our culture is all for the high notes. And a lot of people don't show up for the bereaved because it's too uncomfortable. And Dr. Alan Wolfel actually talks about this rule of thirds, where a third of your people will be horrible and like literally abandon you. A third will be kind of neutral and be like, oh, yeah, sorry about that. Just let me know if you need anything,
Yeah.
right? And then a third of the people will be amazing. But it can be really confusing for grievers when the people they thought would be there for them are unable to be with the discomfort of someone that's grieving.
Absolutely. I don't think that it's talked about enough. And for the people that you just mentioned who feel isolated, I'm really hopeful that this conversation will help encourage them to seek out support. So, again, very grateful to have this conversation today. So, leaving this world is the bookend to being birthed into this world. And I was curious, how do you feel these two experiences in our life, our very first experience and our absolute last experience, complement each other in terms of facing life's adversities?
Well, first of all, I see death as a part of life, not as the opposite of life. But I think what you're talking about is thresholds. And if you look at the meaning of the word thresholds, it comes from the word thresh, which is when you separate like the husk from the oat. And I think it's like these thresholds invite us to really connect with our center and what is most essential in us. Birth and death do both of those things. It's like all the bull falls away and what's left is what matters. So really about the center of what is most essential in life.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. So you've already answered this. Maybe we can explore a bit further. How do people nearing the end of their life define triumph? And are there any common themes and values that emerge?
Yeah, it's almost always love. It really is. And it's almost always people and connection. And there was a study that was done many years ago by a Canadian palliative care physician, Balfort Mount, and it was published in the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management. He interviewed people who were dying, and he found half of the people were okay with dying,
Okay.
and half of the people were not okay with dying. And so he looked at the reasons behind that, and he said the people that were okay with dying had connections in one of four areas. And so if you have a connection to yourself, a deep connection to yourself, this will help you to die well. If you have a deep connection to others. So I think both of those are love, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you have a deep connection to what he calls the phenomenal world, which can be things like nature or music, or a deep connection to a god or an ideal, such as love. These are things that can help us be okay in our dying time. So it really is about connection to love, be it love of self, love of others, love of the phenomenal world, or love of God.
Yes. Yes. Amazing. I love that, obviously. So beautiful. I'm going to share something that I don't know if I'll include. I might cut it out, but I really want to tell you about it. So you mentioned when there's those first moments that you can feel completely numb. I found that for myself. I was staring off into space. I was feeling that numbness coming over me. Before this person passed, I had asked him if he could send me a sign afterwards so that I could know that he was okay and have confirmation that he's still with us. And so he passed and I was looking for the signs. I was like, oh, when's the sign going to come? When's the sign going to come? Why isn't there at least a butterfly flying into my face like everybody always has? And there was nothing. And I was just sitting and spiraling down into that space of resignation about life and really starting to have my beliefs challenged. But it was in that moment that another friend of mine texted me. She only knew that someone very dear to me passed and that I just had lost them. She doesn't know who they are. There's no background history that she's aware of. And she sent me a text, how are you doing? And then she sent me another text asking me about something that she's seeing all around her in that moment that has no meaning for her, but she felt totally compelled to text me and ask me if it had any meaning for me. And it was a sign. It was a sign from him. And it was so specific. It was only something that was a private inside thing between the two of us. And it was in that moment that I obviously burst into tears, but more so because of an immediate presence to love. Just pure love. And I'm sharing this because if there's any way that it can give anyone some kind of comfort in the moments when they are about to lose somebody who's very dear to them or they're really struggling afterwards, maybe this can give some kind of encouragement that we do continue to be connected. And however that is.
That's so beautiful. And love is the only thing that continues after someone dies. It absolutely does. Thank you, first of all. What a beautiful story. And wow.
Do you want to know what it was?
I do, but I didn't want to ask. But yes, I'm like, well, what could it be?
It was the bat signal.
No.
Yes.
Oh, got shivers up the back of my. How did she
Me
get the bat?
too. She was saying, I'm seeing Batman everywhere and the bat signal. Like I'm driving past this store, I'm seeing Batman and the bat signal in the window. My dad and I are talking about Batman right now. We just drove past a toy store that had, and she was like, what's this Batman stuff? So the background story is that was a signal between him and I that was established many years ago. And we used it once to signal to each other that we wanted to be reconnected. And he used it again this time.
Unbelievable. That is unbelievable.
I'm sorry. It's like everything in me not to like lose it right now.
Losing it's okay. Losing it is okay. No, that's remarkable. That really is remarkable. I love that.
Me too. Me too. Okay, so there are 3 types of victories I like to ask guests to share about. And the first one is small daily victories. How do you celebrate small daily victories? And can you give us some examples of those?
Yeah. So again, the word seems so grandiose. And yet, when I think of victories, it's like the little things. It's like being present as I can, connection with my kids. Or yesterday, I had lunch with a dear friend. And it's feeling connected to my husband and calling my mom and tending to my people. And the reason why those are victories is because of the work I do.
Yes.
Because through my doula clients, through going into North Shore Hospice every Monday, I am reminded over and over of what matters most. And I take gratitude seriously in this realm of death work that I work in. If you're holding grief, it's a beautiful balance to hold gratitude as well and be stretched by those forces. Otherwise, the heaviness of death can bleed back into life. So just being with my favorite people, doing my favorite things, caring for my dear self, eating nourishing food, getting good sleeps, that's victories for me.
Oh, I love that so much. The next one is victories within failures. And you've spoken about this throughout this conversation, helping people reframe regrets, failures. Is there a time when you experienced something as a failure that later you were able to recognize as a victory in your life?
Yeah, a huge. I had what I would say is my biggest grief that I carry or loss is around the failure of my first marriage. We had 3 children together, and I was really unable to stay in that relationship. I grew out of it because I actually started feeling worthy of more. As a child, I learned to put parts of myself away to fit in, to be a good girl, to try to be good enough for my dad's love. This continued to play out in my life, and I ended up entering a relationship which gave me that same feeling of not being good enough, of having to do external things to deserve love. And so after my dad and I started coming together in a way that was providing healing, and I started to feel worthy of true love, the marriage just wasn't right for me. What's interesting about this story is that it has a huge grief component to it. I had this vision of myself in a room with a ton of trees in the front window. I saw it. And when I left my home, I left my community. And that was really hard. It was very isolating. A lot of people didn't understand why I was leaving because I was a good girl. I was the perfect wife. I was the good mother. I did all the things. And so there was a lot of judgment. I lost my community aside from about 5 dear friends that knew my heart.
Yeah.
So I lost my marriage, my sense of identity, my home, some extended family. And so it was almost like a complete death of what was.
Yeah.
But this vision of the trees was something I just had. I called my dear childhood friend who was living nearby, and she said, "There's a house for rent 2 doors down. Maybe you want to look at it." So I drove down the road, and there were those trees that I'd seen in my vision. And there was the living room looking out onto these trees. And so I just knew this is the house that I need to be in. I lived there for 3 years. That was like my grief nest. And
Mm.
every morning I would go down into that living room and I would sit with those trees and I would just be with my grief and I would let it have its feelings. And so much about this insecurity, anxiety, this guilt that came from this feeling of separation that I had as a child. I was present with that. And it was just so deeply healing. It was this tenderizing time where I began to have access to my heart, which I didn't before.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I feel like you probably may have already answered this next one. Some of the things you just touched on are probably really important elements in what your rainbow story would be. And a rainbow story is your overarching story in your life that starts with a life lesson or an adversity that you've had to face and overcome, and then transform and use that in how you show up in life for yourself and for others. And so I'm curious if you've been able to identify a connection between things you went through in childhood, things you went through in your later years that then are connected to the work you're doing now, or your life's purpose.
Absolutely. I would say my rainbow story is very clearly about self love, compassion for myself, which has taken me a long time to really nurture and know that I'm human and I'm not perfect and that I will make mistakes and that I'm enough. The hardships that I have been through thankfully guided me back to myself. And that was only something that I was able to discover through being with grief and loss. And it allows me to show up for others in a way that is heart centered. I think there was a quote once that said, tragedy and sorrow can, in a single moment, accomplish more than a lifetime on a meditation cushion. And I really think that's true. I really do.
I love that. Are you ready for a quick round of questions?
Sure.
When do you feel the most seen for who you truly are?
When I'm with dying people and grieving people,
Amazing. How do you honor yourself every day?
I wake up, have a coffee, sit outside, and just be present with myself. And I spend time with Tracy and really get a sense of how she's doing and what she needs for the day.
Gorgeous. What's your favorite way to celebrate?
Okay. Always food, drinks, friends, usually outside, swimming, hiking, moving.
I love it. Do you have a piece of jewelry or accessory that has particular meaning for you? And if so, why?
Yeah, I have two on right now. This is a necklace that my deceased father bought my mom when I was 10 years old. She's Swedish. It's from the Swedish jeweler. It was gifted to me for my 50th birthday by my mama. And then I have a very soulful 14-year-old son who bought me this jade bracelet for my birthday last year. And I have worn it almost 365 days. And he's such a tender heart.
How do you define a victory or a triumph for yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. It's just authenticity. And for me, I think it's that it's having that service piece. Something in the service of others is a definite victory. It has to be something that impacts others in a positive way.
Absolutely. What are some organizations you or your clients work with to receive support during these times? And are there any you recommend?
So there's so many organizations. The Canadian Virtual Hospice is amazing. There's very specific resources for people that are hoping to have a MAID provision, medical assistance in dying. There's a great organization called Bridge C14, which is a Canadian organization. But so much of the care that's given at end of life is done by family and friends. So really what I'm curious about is how can we remember how to show up for each other? And it's not that complicated. I've actually just finished writing a book about this because I'm so passionate about sharing simple information on gentle dying with family and friends so that they are able to understand what they're going through is normal.
I love how you just said, like, how do we learn how to come back to being there for each other. And I contacted Victoria Hospice. And the kindness and compassion that was coming through the phone from this person was just so beautiful. And in that moment, I thought, oh my gosh, I am so grateful that these organizations exist. And there are people there that actually genuinely care. So I'm going for some free counseling. Yeah.
Victoria Hospice is incredible. And for people listening, maybe that aren't in an urban center, something that just came to mind is there's an incredible BC bereavement line. You can call Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and a human being picks up the phone that's trained in compassionate listening. And there's a lot of really great peer support groups out there too. Sometimes people can feel really overwhelmed in the middle of the night. So I really recommend people looking for Facebook groups and different online groups as well. So that's something to consider.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you. So much of this conversation has really been in true alignment with the intention of the work I'm doing through Love Metals and this podcast, which is for people to feel seen, honored, and celebrated, and also to know that they are perfect, whole, and complete. And you've said that several times throughout this conversation, that it's not only important for you, but it's also important for the people that you work with to know that before they leave this world. And so thank you so much for this conversation. It's been personally healing for me. And I really hope that it's been helpful for anyone who's listening or watching who may be losing someone very close to them right now, or who has lost someone. It's also been so insightful into those big existential questions we all ask, and if we don't, should. So that's been a real joy. Tracy, the work you do, you provide a service that is truly beautiful and necessary. So I want to acknowledge you for that and just thank you with all of my heart. Really, thank you so much. You're a beautiful person and soul.
Oh. Thank you. And wow, I just am receiving that because I felt that right there.
Good.
Thank you so much for having me and for being able to talk about something as important as love, which is really the end game. It really is. It was so fun talking to you, and I love the work you're doing. And as I said, I can't wait to get my own love medal. I'm going to get it for myself as a treat when I'm finished a big project I'm working on. I really adore what you're putting out into the world. So it's been an honor.
Thank you. Me too. And it'll be an honor for me to make that for you. So thank you. Tracy, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful stories with us. To honor your dedication, we are presenting you with a Love Medals certificate for going above and beyond in the area of companionship. Your presence brings comfort and dignity to so many, and this small token is a way to recognize the immense impact you have. To our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us. May Tracy's stories inspire you to embrace the transitions in your own life with courage, connection, and love. Tracy's contact details and links to the resources mentioned are in the show notes. Happy holidays, everyone. Until next time, take care and embrace the triumphs that connect us all. I see, honor, and celebrate you. I went on eBay and I bought a vintage bat signal poster that I'm going to put up right there in honor of that.